I didn't have competing priorities. There was just one priority. It really felt like that, knowing that there are no free lunches, and I don't have anything to rely on, wealth-wise or even status-wise or place in the world. And I had to build it from scratch, from nothing. So that was the first time I felt like, what have I done with my life? And it took a great personal toll on my mental health. And I eventually found my way out of it. And that was such an important transformation. Why you're so amazing and how you have to bring your best self to work. And it helped. I'm amazed at how much it helped. It just showing up in a way that, I'm going to crush this day and I belong here and I'm good enough. And it just made a huge difference to me. It wasn't an ROI decision at all. It was just because I wanted to indulge that younger me. People have these interests when they're younger, and those are signals for your hidden talent or for some talent. And if you don't invest in it, and if you don't double down on it, then that's a regret in the making.
Actually, I looked at your LinkedIn profile and you listed clear vision as one of your skills under McKinsey for your personal life. If we then transpose that over, would you say you've always had a clear vision for your life?
No, not at all. In fact, I did this very recently. I did this program with the INSEAD life coach, one of the life coaches, right around building your vision board. And that was the first time I'd actually even thought about the whole concept of a vision board. So I don't think I've been led by a personal vision in the long term. I have had almost mini visions, or sort of in the next 1 to 2 years, here's what I want to do. And I guess subconsciously it is anchored in some kind of a larger vision, but not explicitly anyway. So I don't have a vision board, and I wish I did, but working on that.
Having a clear vision of where you want to go or what you want to do or what's important to you in a life, I think everybody's going to say, yes, that would have been beneficial. But in actually the flip side, not having had a clear vision, you could also argue that didn't hold you back because it didn't marry you to abstract ideas of what you should be doing, where you should be in your life as you compare yourself to others or not. So looking back, would you say not having had a clear vision, actually it hindered you and it pulled you back, or held you back, not pulled you back, held you back, or it actually, to some extent, actually gave you some agility, like it didn't tie you down?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think the latter for sure, right? That it didn't make me, I guess, fixed on something. And I have pivoted many careers and moved across some of these swim lanes, which are relatively untraditional, right? From media to business, like sort of a pretty hardcore consulting field with an arts background, having not studied math. So I think if I had had a clear vision that I only want to be as a journalist, which is where I really started my career, I might have hesitated to move away from it. I suspect. I don't know, but I don't have regrets. So it's not like I look back and think this is the one thing that held me back. Not having a clear long-term vision. I did have short-term plans, which is very different, and that I think worked out well. And I've been quite agile and just sort of flexible with moving. And it's also because, and this is something I'm struggling with at this phase, and which is why I'm in this whole trying to build a vision board, which is I don't know what I'm solving for anymore. But so far, I think I've been solving for growth, learning, opportunity. And that comes in various shapes and forms. And so that agility kind of also lent itself well to an environment where what I was solving for was transferable across fields and across topics and themes, you know?
You used the term or the word anymore. That means like there was a step change, or what does that mean?
Definitely feeling a bit, I can't remember where I said anymore, but I think in this context, now I think I would like to have a vision just because life is becoming complex I'm growing older with a child and with multiple priorities. And I think when I was younger, I didn't have competing priorities. There was just one priority. It really felt like that, which was to grow, learn, move, progress, and just sort of make my place in the world or find my place in the world in some way. And that took so many forms, right? Professional, personal, where I lived, things like that. But now I find myself in a different space, and which is defined by almost competing priorities, each of which are important to me in different ways and different dimensions. And that is it it feels like it can slow me down, which is fine, but I have to also accept a whole new pace of life. And so what is the vision then? And what will make me feel like I'm doing, in everything in service of that vision? Because it's very easy to feel dissatisfied or at the same time thoroughly content with the day to day, but dissatisfied with where you're going. And that kind of
Hmm.
paradox, to hold that in my head, this is new to me, where I love day to day being with my son and doing the things I do. But on the long run, in the long run, I feel like, where am I really going? So that's the struggle right now. So that's why I don't think it serves me anymore. This agility, or yeah.
You write for a website, or I guess an organization called the Decision Lab.
Mm, yeah,
You're in midst of your Master of Science in Behavior Science from LSE.
yeah.
There's a lot of diving deep in that intersection of behavior science and technology, or let's call it ramping up maybe. How has your pursuit of mastery of expertise, and I guess we'll need to talk about both as in of personal and professional growth. How has that pursuit of mastery changed over the past few years?
I think in my earlier years, it wasn't so much looking to be a master or an expert in a certain craft. It was driven by curiosity, and it to some degree it still is. So I actually wouldn't even I. It's interesting you phrase it like that, because I wouldn't characterize myself as in pursuit of mastery at all. I'm in pursuit of learning and satisfying some sort of curiosity. And and it's so that's interesting that you phrase it like that. Um, because I do feel like I'm not really going as deep on topics as I would like to. But objectively, if you look at it, I probably am. You know, going fairly deep on behavior science and thinking through these things. But then, that phrase, the more you know, the more you know how less you know, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how I constantly feel. So the deeper I go in topics, and I'm fairly deep, I guess, in behavior science and technology at this point, but I'm just so incredibly aware of how little I know in those fields, because then there are people who spend their entire lives really researching and going super deep on that topic. So I constantly feel like I'm skimming the surface of many things. But so that's kind of the first thing on this. I also have, I think, over the past few years, learned to put this, or I'm trying to put this whole idea of intellectual curiosity in perspective, because I don't, it is not, and I don't want it to be the only defining pillar of my life. And it has been important, but I, I think there are other pieces as well. And so now I'm in this phase where I'm trying to put this in perspective, i.e., this outside of intellectual curiosity, there's also a whole thing around impact, which really does matter to me. And I don't mean this necessarily as social impact. I mean this as just moving the needle on something.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really important to me. And I think almost as of mastery as that, which is, how do I learn to create impact wherever I am? And that could take different shapes and forms, but it could be business metrics, which is also um, that are really critical and important to me in day-to-day work, or just some kind of influence on end output. So that's kind of the other one. Then there's this personal influence, which also is beginning to be important to me as I'm growing older, which is the people I share my space and lives with, professionally, personally, and have I influenced anyone to be better, different? And that takes forms of mentoring and just spending time with colleagues, peers, leaders, etc., and building that leadership skill and ability over time. So that's also important to me. So to me, these three, which is intellectual curiosity, impact, and influence, are all kind of in that puzzle. But I just
Mm-hmm.
think I tend to over index on intellectual curiosity. And I now want to start evening this out a bit over time, because, yeah, it's different contours of the career.
I think you wrote, um, I will not die an unlived life. I
Oh,
will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. I choose to inhabit my days, to allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing.
where did
Tell
you
me
find
about
this, Christian? Oh,
tell me about growing up in India.
Oh wow. I had forgotten about that. Firstly, I wrote it somewhere. I rewrote. It's a quote from someone much, yeah, more popular and well written, or whatever. But I didn't write it, but I absolutely it resonates with me for multiple reasons. Growing up in India, so I grew up with in a family which was I was very fortunate to be in a close knit family. My dad and my mom and my sister and I, we were very close. We moved around every year, 2 years, because my dad was in the Air Force, and that just meant he was moving from station to station. And so I had a nomadic childhood, which meant that we then became closer, I guess, than we would have been if we had roots. Um, we didn't have a ton of money growing up, but enough to sort of have a safe, happy, healthy childhood, and I'm very grateful for that. But I was very aware of the fact that I need to make my own way in the world. And my mother actually, especially, didn't come from, she had a difficult childhood. And so she kept sort of, I think her message and her sort of life had a great impact on how I grew up thinking and
Hmm.
feeling about the world, and knowing that nothing is, there are no free lunches, and I don't have anything to rely on, wealth wise, or even status wise or place in the world. And I had to build it from scratch, from nothing, because she came from nothing, as she'd say it. But to her,
Hmm.
education was really important, and that was considered always the way out of that um, sort of cycle or trap. And so to me, education then became, and school and academics, all of that became really important, and it was ingrained. And my mom always used to say this, which is, you have to give back to society. Not, you get so much from it, from people around you. You have, the facilities and amenities and hospitals, and there's a whole society that is geared to make your life easy, and you have to give back to it. Otherwise, this is not for free. And that was such a powerful theme, and which I think lends itself to me feeling like wherever I am, I need to do something, and to be to be of value, or to generate value. And um, otherwise, like, what am I even doing? And so constantly having to define my place in the world kind of comes from that. But growing up in India, it was wonderful for many reasons, because I moved around so much, and every other year
Hmm.
we were in a different state, different, you know um, part of the country. And India is very diverse geographically, so exposure to multiple cultures, building that kind of adaptability at a young age, because you had to refresh your social circle every year, and start anew in a new school. And that's hard when you're a teenager, but just getting used to that,
Hmm.
I think, was good over time. And had, yeah, wonderful sort of family and friends, and just truly, now that I think about it, and an idyllic childhood in every way. And kids don't really need much, so beyond safety, health, and love, I had a lot of that.
It's what I find interesting is this notion of, and I mean, to some extent, you phrased it a little bit like as in coming out of, um, you didn't say bubble, but as in reference to your mom, and nothing in life is free or is being handed to you, right?
Hmm.
And you have to work for you to get to, let's say, to a better place.
Hmm.
um, Talk to me a little bit about this notion of leaving India, like coming to Europe or North America. um, what did that mean to you?
Mm. Yeah, um, I'm very aware that there is a general, I think, notion that life in the West is more appealing when you come from an Eastern culture, right? So that's the general perception. It is, um, the way I saw it, it was a sign of progress in some way. It was a sign of, um, I guess, making it. So that's kind of the early versions of, I think, what brought me to even explore and think of the idea that I want to move abroad, and I want to have a global career and global
Hmm.
um, path. And I do, admittedly, it was a lot of signaling in the beginning. When I say beginning, I mean before I even set on the path, right? It was just indicative of success. And that's kind of got me started. And then the more I spent time abroad, which is INSEAD for me was the biggest, or was the only time when I moved out of the country, really. So until then, I had spent all my life and career in India. And having said that, I did have a kind of global upbringing in many ways. So that culturally now I know wasn't that distant, because I think my parents were very broad-minded and well-read, and we used to read a lot, and generally, so culturally it didn't feel that distant, but of course physically it was. And so INSEAD was a big move for me, and once I was there, I think I thrived a lot in that environment of global diversity, of cultural connection, and I actually oddly found a lot of I found home culturally in a different way abroad,
Hmm.
which I didn't find in some ways back home. And that sounds odd to say, but just the open mindedness with which I was raised, I found that in many circles internationally. And so, what started off as a signaling or a sign of success, I think transformed over time, the more time I spent abroad, into a cultural home. And and so therefore I sort of didn't choose to go back, and stayed. And obviously there were aspects um, of economics, right? So like I had to just to pay back my loan, and
Hmm.
needed to do that in a way. So I had to earn in a currency that was at least like the euro, or different. But so there were practical considerations as well. But I think at some point I could have chosen to go back, and I haven't yet, and maybe I will in the future. But so far, it just has felt like I have found um, a lot more cultural connection than I expected. And so that's what's kept me going. And undeniably, the professional opportunities um, keep that going as well.
Hmm.
And I think as a woman in business, it also is a different way to think about it, right? So, although I know India is sort of a growing economy, and if I want to be wealthy, I think being back there is probably the way to go. So, but I'm yeah, it's a tough one on what will make me go back or not. But the path of getting here and continuing to stay here, I think just has been so rewarding, culturally, intellectually, and I feel like my world opened up when I went to INSEAD, and has continued to do so. So that's what keeps me going.
Were there some instances where you were thinking, "Hey, I can't do this. This seems too big. This seems too much of a hurdle. This isn't me." And how did you deal with that?
Mm. I can think of two big instances for that. One was just when I'd arrived at INSEAD, the first 2 months, I think those were the hardest. I felt like I was a fish out of water, and I didn't feel like I belonged. And I mean, I know a lot of INSEADers feel like that, but
Yeah.
um, that doesn't minimize everyone's individual experience. It's an intense experience. And that was the first time I felt like, what have I done with my life? And it took a great personal toll on my mental health. And I eventually found my way out of it. And that was such an important transformation, um, grounded in some kind of acceptance of my identity. And the way I
Hmm.
always thought about it was, all through my life growing up, I was always surrounded by Indians. And I therefore was not aware of my Indianness, because it was just all around me, and nobody
Hmm.
was Indian as different from anybody else. And the moment I stepped outside of that, my identity as an Indian person just became suddenly much more, I guess, much larger than it had been in my head. And so for me, it had to be an identity reset for who I am. And so that took me a bit of time to accept all of these things about me. And I'm not saying it was not hard because I was ashamed of it or anything. It was just a net new component of my identity that I had just never even thought about. Um, and and so that was kind of really interesting. Um, and everyone I grew up had an Indian accent, and so I wasn't aware of how I sounded. And then I started to I hear differences, and said, "Oh, this is how I sound, and it's different from how others sound, and that's wonderful." And I'm going to embrace that, and I love that about myself. And that
Hmm.
journey was a difficult one, but I think and that's kind of part of what I loved about this experience, that I'm so grateful I got to go on this journey and embrace myself wholly. So that was the first difficult process, I think. And Indianness and accent is just one part of it, but there were so many other things. I came from an arts background, and I didn't see it. Lots of people felt like kind of understood finance, and economics and accounting, and they were just on it, and I just felt behind because to me this was all net new. I didn't know, yeah, the ABCs of balance sheet and business, and so that was all of that for multiple reasons. That transformation, I think, was the first step. I think the second time I felt like that was at McKinsey, which was the next sort of big transformation. Um, and this after INSEAD, when I started in New York, it was again a whole new world of professional competence, international exposure. And INSEAD had set me up in some way, but it had truly just been 10 months since I had left my bubble and at home. And now I was in this highly competitive, intense business environment. And so that was kind of a new step change. And again, I think I really struggled through that in the first year. And I remember having this conversation with my DGL. They used to call DGL, but basically a senior partner who was responsible for your development. And I
Mm-hmm.
had my one of my early check-ins with her in the office, and she said, "So how are you doing?" And the only thing I remember saying was, "I'm surviving." And she said, "You're not thriving. How come you're just surviving?" And that really stuck with me. And I said, "Okay, that's interesting. What can I do to move into the other phase of thriving, and what will that
Mm-hmm.
take?" And I think being intentional about that, right from morning rituals and meditation and sort of the obvious but really important things, um, talking to an executive coach and just reading self-help, all of the things that are part of that formula of mindset building. I leaned on every single trick in the book, and it
Mm-hmm.
helped, and I found some kind of strength yet again. And so that was kind of the next part, the next transformation. And I'm so grateful to YouTubers, because truly there was a couple of YouTubers who would talk about self-help and gratitude and affirmations and all the good stuff. And I would
Mm-hmm.
almost every day, going into the office on my in my cab, I would listen to some like 10-minute YouTube about just why you're so amazing and how you can have to bring your best self to work. And it helped. I'm amazed at how much it helped. It just showing up in a way that, yeah, I'm going to crush this day and I belong here, and I'm good enough. And it just made a huge difference to me. Some people might not need it, and all of that. I don't want to say it's for everyone, but for me, I think it helped me move from a space of underconfidence, insecurity, fear, and almost being paralyzed by that, to a place where I could thrive and bring my best self and really, yeah, show up well every day, or
Mm-hmm.
almost every day. Um, yeah.
It's interesting as you've and as what I understand to be, it's actually real. It's neuroplasticity, right? As in where we grow up with certain frameworks or principles in our lives, and um, for better or worse, I mean that starts with our parents, with our friends, as in we see things happening or working in a certain way, and it's also the feedback that you receive as a kid, as you grow, as you learn, as you do role play, etc., and as you come to understand your boundaries. And if the mantra as a kid, or as you grow into a well, transform into a full-fledged human being, you know, if you're used to somebody reminding you, as in, hey, you have limitations,
Mm,
there's only so much you can do, and those are things that you definitely shouldn't do, because most likely you're not going to be good at that, right? And that's all of a sudden the foundation you grow up with, as opposed to and interesting also that you said this might not be the same or work for other people, because individuals grow up in different ways and grow
hmm
up with a different um, well different starting points, a different coach or somebody cheering them on in the background. And as an adult, there's actually there's quite a bit of science around, you can actually rewire your brain of how you think
Yeah.
subconsciously around certain things or challenges that you're confronted with, which then
hmm
speaks to what you said. Hey, although it might come across to sound cheesy, and I say that because actually I started doing that as well, where on a daily basis for 3 or 4 weeks in a row, I would listen to positive self-talk. And um, yes, as cheesy as that sounds, or even the specific YouTube videos, as cheesy as that sounds, it does something to your brain, because all of a sudden you're your instinctual reaction or response to certain challenges is different.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's, you could argue, hey, this is not subconscious, but maybe it just serves as a more often than not reminder that things can in fact be different, and that you don't need to start off from the neurotic point of view, as in, nah, this is not going to work, or this, I'm not going to be good at that. Um,
Yeah.
and in a sense, then, and maybe not to go in and say, you know what, I'm going to kick some ass here, I'm the best at this. We talked earlier about mastery as opposed to intellectual curiosity. Um, but I think the space in between is actually to return to almost a childlike approach,
Mm-hmm.
where you say, I'm actually, I may not have this figured out, but at the end of the day, I'm still going to be around. I'm going to survive this, and I will be better for that experience, because in the worst case scenario, I'm going to learn something. Um, when someone first meets you, you actually come across as, I'm going to say, quite well put together, and you are well put together, and in terms of your joyful, your professional, you seem very much in control. I was say almost like in control, almost to like a hyper seers extent, as in this person means business, like very business facing, McKinsey-ish. I mean, that's the period when you and I met, when you were at McKinsey, and then Riya also sings. So, and you don't just sing, like you've properly recorded covers of Kelly Clarkson, for example. Um, and you also got into producing videos for your own YouTube stream. So you do a lot of activities, or let's say resources, in terms of the time or energy that you spend on that, on endeavors that aren't considered, let's say, a safe, perhaps even serious, as in, and as a grown up,
Mm-hmm.
should you be really be doing this or spending your time on that, and b, that don't necessarily yield like a massive or yield massive immediate feedback,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're kind of uh, we're now at a stage where we say, well, unless I get the proper output, I'm not sure it's worth the input. All right.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit more about how you live out your inner child, and the decisions that you've made to share that with the world. How do you go about that?
Such great questions, Christian. Very impressive. Um, so this thing about singing, this started, and there's sort of a bit of context and history here. So when I was growing up, I was into music as a teenager. I started playing guitar, and I always wanted to be able to accompany guitar with singing because I felt that sort of made sense and was a wonderful skill to have. And but I didn't have musical training growing up. That was just not a priority in my family as much. And um, I started late. I got like when I was 16 is when I started to get some guitar classes. But that's kind of late in that world. So I remember having this distinct conversation with my sister, and I said I want to be Avril Lavigne when I grow up, and that was she was my star, right? And it's interesting. My sister said, "Look, and oh God, I wonder how she'll feel when she watches this." But she said, "Look, you have a lot of talent, but we didn't start early, so you probably will never be as good as Avril Lavigne. And so maybe you should do something else with your career and do this on the side." And she was right, I think, objectively, right? At 16, you start training. Avril Lavigne probably started when she was 5, or all of these great musicians start really early and they grow up in this environment where musical training is ingrained and it's hard work to be that good. And I got this very practical perspective from my older sister, and I took that to heart and I said, yeah, she's probably right. I can't be a successful rock star singer as the only thing. So I'll do something else. So I went ahead with my normal career, and at some point ended up at in New York as a consultant and had a full time job. And that point, I started to question. Okay, I have these weekends, and I now am at this point where I have gotten somewhere professionally, and so I can start to do this just because. And I was very intentional about taking up music and joining music lessons because it wasn't an ROI decision at all. It was just because I wanted to indulge that younger me and that child, exactly as you say, who wanted to be a singer when she grew up. And so I could be a singer on my time and
Mm-hmm.
for nobody's pleasure, for no other sort of vested interest. And so I took up these singing lessons on the weekend, and I used to go to Brooklyn, and my singing teacher was this 50-year-old woman from Azerbaijan, opera singer in New York, wonderful woman, and it felt therapeutic to just be with her because she was
Mm-hmm.
one of those classical opera singers who lived their life in music and
Mm-hmm.
are soaked in music in every way. So it was so wonderful, and I felt like I had earned the right to gift myself this time. And it was expensive, and I took effort to travel all the way. But anyway, I did that, and it's interesting because 6 months into those lessons, I started to get better than I thought I could get, and I started to sing well ish. And at that point, I said, maybe I could do this professionally. And I remember the next few months after I made that mental shift, I hated singing because I was just every time trying to compare myself with the other singers. And I was trying to, now I was thinking ROI, and I was thinking, okay, how can I
Mm-hmm.
build a career in music? How can I be a professional singer? What will it take? Maybe I should also learn piano and practice for exactly 30 minutes every day. And the moment I made it a race in my head, it sucked all the joy out of it. And so then I consciously went back to this, no, no, this is just for me, it's just for joy. And so I found this interesting distinction between things I do just for joy, just for me, no ROI,
Mm-hmm.
and things I do in the normal world, practical gains and things like that. And music is one of those. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't spend enough time on music anymore, but it was just so important that if I had to live my life all over again, I think I would start with music earlier and make that a bigger part of my life, and it just isn't. And the other thing I read somewhere about talent is that people have these interests when they're younger, and those are signals for for your hidden talent or for some talent. And if you don't invest in it, and if you don't double down on it, then that's a regret in the making. And so you'd be like 60 looking back and say, oh, I could have been a great musician, but and then life never got in the way or whatever. But the interest could have made you a phenomenal something. And so I know that I had that. And I feel like in an alternate life, I would be, hopefully, like a really good musician, but I'm not, and it's fine. But interestingly, the master's that I'm doing in behavior science, I think I started also with this idea of no ROI. It is one of the things I do just for joy. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think as an adult who has found, I don't want to say this, but like some professional stability as in my grown up years, I have now started to invest some time and resources in things I do just for joy, and it kind of keeps me sane and happy. So I hope I'll continue to do that. I think it's an important way to live, according to me.
It's an interesting. I mean, I used the word step change earlier, but as in progression. I want to use the word progression. As you said, as you've like reached a certain like professional, yeah. Well, you didn't say professional status, but as in a
Stability, I
certain
said stability. That's the word.
stability.
But yeah,
There
yeah.
you go. That you then like this hasn't translated into some I almost want to say hedonistic treadmill, right?
Mm,
Or some people might actually interpret it as well. Now you're all out, not all out, but you're doing certain things just for joy or fun. But it's this is not about consuming things. This is about
mm,
um, seeking out specific parts of you that as you tap into them become extremely enriching to your life,
yeah.
right? Which then I mean my point of view on that would be then actually then reflects on the people around you as well, because all of a sudden you have more to share of yourself, um,
Mm,
which you wouldn't necessarily have if you said, I'm going to buy a fancier car, or again, I'm going to get a bigger house or
mm,
flat, or here's the jewelry, which are all nice tokens. I'm going to say, my opinion is to signal or signify as in, hey, I've reached a certain milestone, and I can go a little bit irrational on these things, because in the end, a watch, you know, most watches tell you the time, and some watches do more than that. But it's interesting that you then made the decision as in, I'm going to explore other parts of myself, or develop other parts of myself further that aren't, as you phrased it, necessarily about the ROI,
mm,
right? And
yeah.
and don't necessarily directly, I want to say, put food on the table as far as providing for a family is concerned. You talked about your son earlier, and the responsibility that comes with all of a sudden having a job as a mother.
Yeah.
and as a wife, etc. And but it does, I think, feedback in other ways. Um, Now, there's a lot of wisdom we've gone over today. A lot of lessons learned. If you had to pick out, let's say, two lessons or two things, we'd say this is vastly different. Or I look at this vastly differently today than I did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And
Mm.
you'd have an opportunity to speak to your 25-year-old self. What would those two things be?
The first one would be some version of perspective, which is um, in those moments where it feels like the world is crashing around you and everything seems like it's going under, I
Mm-hmm.
would, it's important to zoom out and keep perspective because that just helps stabilize a rocky ship, I have found. And this is something I learned over the past few years, and I would have benefited from adopting some of this in my early 20s as well. So that's something I would say to my younger self, that just breathe in and it's all going to work out, and even if it doesn't, you'll figure a way out of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so just keeping perspective and being grateful in the larger scheme of things, um, while obviously keeping the hustle and the dreams and the ambition, but not letting that shake you to your core because you know that you're stronger than that. That would be the first one. And then the second is, which I'm still trying to adopt, and I wish I'd known this earlier and had tried to adopt this even earlier, is consistency. And that's so hard. And
Mm-hmm.
I know enough is written about it and spoken about it in today's productivity part of the internet. But consistency really is everything. And the times in my life when I have really accomplished my goals has been when I have been consistent and deliberate about every single day doing some small thing and chipping away at it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I would just remind that I think if I had known earlier, I would have benefited. So I would tell my younger self as well that pick the goal and then really double down on it every single day. And that takes mindset and some of the positive self talk and discipline. But yeah, consistency is really important. So that's the other thing.
Um, if you well, if you come up with a definition of what it means to make it in life today, also
Mm,
versus what, let's say, you strive for. I mean, we touched on growing up in India and what it means to make it and to leave India. So if you had to come up with a definition for making it in life today,
yeah.
how is that different than it would have been many years back?
So I have this. I think the younger me would have said something a lot more objectively measurable and practical, right? Because that was the goal I anchored on, such as a global career, X amount of, financial stability, wealth, etc. Again, notice I say stability, not wealth, because that's for me, it's a lot about covering the downside and not so much the upside. But anyway, so I would have, so the younger me would have talked about objective measures of growth and success. But I think
Mm-hmm.
the me now will define making it as um, this some version of peace and honesty. And I say that because and I have this T-shirt which says "Inner peace is the new success." And it's like my sleeping T-shirt, and I love that. And I really think to me now, making it would be being at peace with what you have and where you're going, not just what you have as in the moment in time only, but with your path
Mm-hmm.
and with your unique, destination as different from others. And so that is kind of the first part of this. But I think this can very easily get distorted if you're not careful. And the second that has to almost be a prerequisite for inner peace is brutal honesty with yourself. And that's harder than the semblance of peace, because you can meditate every day and feel like you're being peaceful and acting peaceful, but and say that, oh, I don't want any of these status symbols or worldly desires. No, no. But I think that can be easily a trap if you're not brutally honest and look yourself in the mirror and say, I really, for example, care about having that Rolex or a big
Mm-hmm.
car or a fancy house, and it's important to me. And so I will only be at peace once I achieve that. And that's fine. Then you go down that road and you achieve that, and that's when you have peace. So I don't mean peace as a way to renounce worldly pleasures at all, but I
Mm-hmm.
mean peace with who you are uniquely, honestly, in the most raw way, and then being on that path and not letting the noise of the world get in the way. To me, that is success. The Yeah, something about raw self-awareness and how that translates into comfort with you and your path. And I didn't think of that when I was younger.
To not let the noise of the world get in the way.